So I'm going to talk a little bit about design in animation and specifically about character design and what goes into making good character design on an animated film. And the reason I've got the Lion King here is I think this is an example of a really, really well designed film. The designs are beautifully done. They're very, very attractive, very appealing. But in particular, they all contrast one another very well. And you'll see that there's really no mistaking who these characters are. Apart from the female lions, which look quite similar, all of the other characters contrast one another beautifully. The hyenas look a bit similar, but it doesn't really matter because they're a pack. Everyone else, you know exactly who it is, and yet they're all part of the same universe. And that, I think, is one of the most important things in good design on an animated film. So, to begin with the basics of design, good design is about simplicity, clarity, and contrast. And you can break almost everything down in design terms into really simple shapes. So even people can be reduced to squares, circles, triangles, very, very simple shapes. And if you begin with a simple shape, you'd almost always get a good caricature. Caricaturists know this, that everyone is reducible to a simple shape. So we can draw a sort of smiley face on these characters, and already they've got a little bit of personality to them. Now we can play this with the movies, with film stars. So if I ask you who are these two movie stars, and you think back to the early days of cinema, you will, I hope, recognise Laurel and Hardy. Now, these aren't great caricatures of Laurel and Hardy, but at their essence, that's who these characters are. And the point of these characters is that they contrast one another extremely well. One is fat and stupid. The other is skinny and intelligent. I mean, Laurel thinks he's stupid, but actually is intelligent. Hardy thinks he's intelligent, but actually is stupid. That's the whole point. They contrast one another, and they're easily caricatured. And here they are on a poster for a film back in the 40s. A great contrast. Now, if I ask you again, who are these two movie stars? And I'm thinking here of a movie, actually a Disney movie from the early 1980s. And it's Schwarzenegger and DeVito. Now, in reality, they're not physically so different. If you look at them here, I mean, one's obviously shorter than another. But in caricature terms, if we were to caricature them for a film, we'd end up with something like this. So that's the idea. That's the basis of what we're doing, is trying to find contrasts. Now, about 10 years ago, there was an election in California. It's the one that Schwarzenegger was involved in. And there was a recall, and Schwarzenegger had to run against two other candidates. One was called Gray Davis, a Democrat here, and another, perhaps he was I forget actually what parties they all represented, but there was Chris Bustamante as well. I remember looking at the debates on TV and thinking that there was really no doubt who was going to win. I remember looking at these men on television. One was very, very tall and skinny. There was Schwarzenegger, this sort of enormous figure towering over the others, and there was Bustamante, this short Latin guy over here. And I just remember thinking, there's no way Schwarzenegger isn't going to win. Just in appearances alone, he's bound to make it. And in fact, he did, and he was elected and became the gubernator and all of that. So let's look at another movie. Here are two characters from a film that I'm sure you'll all recognize. And these characters are, of course, R2-D2 and C-3PO. And they are basically a lovely study in contrasts, and can be reduced easily to very simple shapes. And actually interesting that they're kind of like Laurel and Hardy, only in reverse. In this case, it's C-3PO who's the smart one, but nobody listens to. R2-D2 is the smart one that nobody listens to. And C-3PO is the one who thinks he's clever but always gets it wrong. So they're actually a mirror image of Laurel and Hardy. Now, simple design. Obviously, I'm sure you're familiar with the Mr. Men books. One of the reasons that the Mr. Men books are so successful for children is because they contrast one another really, really clearly. And children need to be shown simple pictures to see the world in simple terms. Otherwise, they get confused and bored. And so good children's books have very, very simple contrasting characters. And the characters should contrast one another, not just in terms of the colors, but also in the shapes and also in the personality of the characters. And that's what makes those books so brilliant for young kids. Here's a film I worked on. This is Robots, a film for Blue Sky, and lovely contrast here between Rodney Copperbottom on the left and Ratchet on the right. He is sleek and grey and pointy. Rodney has round edges, is blue, and kind of has soft edges. So they contrast each other nicely. Again, back to The Lion King, you've got lovely contrasts all the way through the film between all of the characters, and it works really, really well. Every character having its own shape, its own color, its own personality, and its own unique design, and yet all part of one overall universe. Beautiful design includes the Winnie the Pooh characters. These are the original E.H. Shepard drawings, which I personally prefer to the Disney ones, although the Disney ones have been made more contrasting in a way, because Disney took them and made Pooh yellow, made Rabbit brown, Eeyore is grey, and Piglet is pink, and that helps to create really, really nice contrast. I got to work on one of these movies. It was Piglet's big movie. It was the one I worked on in Japan, and it was really fun animating them because they all animated completely differently. Eeyore especially is very slow moving. Pooh is, has a sort of soft animation style, and Tigger is just sort of jumping all over the place. So part of the fun there was to animate them in different ways. Here's another example of really good design. It's from the Jungle Book. Different shapes, colors, personality, and also style of animation from these great characters, Baloo and Bagheera and Mowgli. Really marvelous characters in those films. And actually the plot of the Jungle Book is extremely thin. If you actually write down the plot and tell it, there's barely anything to it. But it's the characters that make that film really work and really come alive. Again, with the Seven Dwarves, it's all about the contrasting characters of those dwarves that make them, although there are 7 of them, you can tell them apart because each one has such a different personality. Again, back to Robots. One of the nice things about this, the Rusties all had different colours, so you immediately knew where you were. You knew which character was which, and for small kids, that's really, really important. Roger Rabbit, again, another example of really, really nice contrasting characters and designs. And I think if you look at the recent DreamWorks films, they've really, really nailed this. They've really got it right so that all of the characters contrast one another beautifully. However, if you look at some of the older ones, and this is one that I worked on, The Road to El Dorado, and I think that these characters didn't really contrast one another that well. Miguel and Tulio were a little bit too similar, and the designers of the film struggled with this rather realistic style to find contrasting shapes. Again, if you look at The Prince of Egypt, these are beautiful designs. I mean, there's no way I could paint as well as this, but the characters do not really contrast one another sufficiently well, I think, to create something that's suitable for little kids. Here's a film that I saw when I was a child. It's a movie called Watership Down, where they really struggled, I think, to find strong contrast between the characters. I remember watching this film when I was little, and I had no idea who all the rabbits were. I was totally confused, and I remember being very bored and rather distressed by the whole experience. I think it's a real challenge, and we had the same thing with a more recent British film called Valiant, where the pigeons all, despite the heroic efforts of the designers here, somehow or other they all kind of look quite similar. And I think that was one of the problems with that film. So back to Star Wars, wonderful character design, wonderful contrast here. There's no mistaking who these characters are. And we know who the good guys are because they're using color coding for us. Good guys in white on the left, bad guys in black on the right, just like the old westerns where we had white hats and black hats. There's Lee Van Cleef looking particularly menacing in his black hat on the right. And also it's digging into folk memories. Luke Skywalker looks like a soldier with his leggings and everything. And of course, the Star Wars bad guys look like they've got this sort of German helmet style of thing. So they're digging back into folk memories of the war and so on. Even the animals contrast in Star Wars. You'll see that the walkers basically are essentially elephants. They move like elephants. They walk like elephants. They're like sort of highly stylized elephants without a trunk. And again, if you look at the bad guys, have this sort of enormous Death Star, and then the good guys have these little kind of mosquitoes things that buzz around and try and try and attack it. Again, lovely contrasts in the bad guy fighters. You've got warm colours here over for the good guys, and very cool colours there over for the bad guys. So you've got colour contrast as well as shape contrasts. And then, of course, Darth Vader has to have his own special fighter to make him stand out from the rest. Pixar did this incredibly well, and one of the great characters in the Toy Story movies has been Buzz Lightyear, who's been reinvented in every movie. So in the first movie, he's a non-self-aware toy whose journey is to become self-aware, and then in the second movie, we meet his alter ego, or we meet a non-self-aware Buzz. So we actually have two Buzzes. And then in the third movie, he becomes Spanish Buzz. So they're constantly reinventing this character who actually contrasts with himself. This is a sketch that I did for a poster design for an animated film being made in Israel, where we were doing plants. This was a particularly tricky job. Because plants don't necessarily contrast one another. They do contrast one another, but it's hard to get human caricatures out of them. So that was quite a design challenge there. One of the solutions that I came up with was to do a sort of a simple sheet of, to try and reduce each character to simple shapes, because I found that the storyboard artists were drawing them all the same, so that I couldn't tell, looking at the storyboard panels, which character was which. So I thought, well, if we can create simple shapes for them, then they'll contrast one another better. And it worked pretty well. So as Rose, she was a sort of posh character, formal, upper class, a sort of caricature of an English Rose, rather haughty, and so on. Here's a movie poster. This is a sketch that I did for a movie poster for a film that I'm working on, and I'm trying to get as lovely contrasts here in these characters, so that we sort of know who they all are without even being told anything about them. And here's some more examples there of the various characters and hopefully contrasting one another nicely. Although I think there's still some more work to go on creating different shapes for these characters. Here's a TV series I've been working on, which again, hoping to have nice contrast with these characters here. So I think that is one of the most important things. Peppa Pig does this extremely well. Very, very simple designs, very limited animation, but being incredibly successful. And you know who you are. Where you are with these characters. Daddy Pig, Peppa Pig, Mummy Pig. They're all beautifully distinguished. Here's some characters I did. This is my cartoon strip that runs in the Times. Queen's Counsel. I don't think I've ever really quite achieved the range of contrast in the character design that I would have liked. And here's another I did for a strip about art dealers that ran in the Tatler back in the 1990s. Proportions are obviously also incredibly important. How many heads can you fit into the character? A normal human is something like one head goes into the body seven times for a grown man, and with a toddler it's about 4. And if you look at Asterix here, he's just 1.5, so he's really very childlike proportions. And the more childlike you make the proportions, the more cute and appealing the character will be. The smaller you make the head, the more you make Batman feel like a superhero. So it's all a question of what you're trying to achieve and how you want the characters to feel. So I'd say in conclusion that what we're looking for is first of all for clarity. I think I'd put this one first, or possibly even simplicity first. But these are the 5 things. You want an original design. You don't want it to look derivative. You want it to be clear. You want it to be simple. You want them all to cohere, so they feel like they're all part of one universe, and they should all contrast one another as far as is possible. So that's the end of this short discourse on character design. Obviously, there's an awful lot more to be said on the subject, but those are some of the thoughts that I've had working on films and some of the discoveries that I've made along the way.